That's fine, yeah.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Daryl Connor is here, and he's going to be presenting today on my life as the Forrest Gump of Humanisitic Psychology.
Hi. So I'm a 72 graduate and been just incredibly fortunate in the 45 years since leaving here in terms of what's unfolded in my life. And the reference to Forrest Gump is that there's a case to be made that I don't get much credit for anything about what's happened. It's sort of unfolded, and I got to be there. So I don't really have content to share with you as much as I'd like to share some of the events that have unfolded, and mostly focus in on how those events tie back to the seeds that were planted for me here, and encourage you to look for some of the seeds that have been planted for you. So the path for me is running now 45 years, and I'd like to describe what that path is. I'd like to share with you what I consider the grace that happened when I was here with faculty and my colleague students, and the seeds that were planted. So the path, to me, the only value in sharing with you what has happened to me since I was here is to provide context for the seeds. And so to me, the real story isn't what unfolded for me, but the impact of this program and how important it has been in my life and how it's allowed me to move forward. And of course, the seeds that were planted here. So the path itself has some phases. There were some phases before I got to Carrollton. I started off pretty asleep, and then spent some time in the military, and then I found West Georgia, and then that moved on to a career. So pre-West Georgia, to say that I didn't have a clue would be gracious. I came to the school thinking that this was a trip instead of a journey, to give you some sense of how to think I was with life in general. But anyway, so I came pretty raw, and but before I got here, I spent 3 years at Fort Benning, Georgia, and there I learned that I could separate myself from the Southern Baptist white privileged upbringing that I had, and that there was actually other aspects to life. I was very fortunate to be dropped into an environment, because the area that I worked in the Army was in the clinical psychology area for the Army. So the psychiatrists and the social workers and the psychologists that I had exposure to were just phenomenal, and the training with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Virginia Satir, and it was just a remarkable. I actually considered it pre-graduate school. That's how intense that experience was for me. I first touched what it was like to be in service to others, and found that resonated with me. And also, it's the first time that I had an awareness and any kind of self-reflection. And so all of that culminated into me beginning to search the distinctions in those days between clinical and behavioral, and there's this little emerging thing called humanistic, and this weird little enclave in Georgia where something was happening, and so the command and control days of the military were important in the journey, but only to set me up to come here. So I spent my time here, but I spent more time at West Georgia than just the days as a student. I'll come back and talk about the seeds that were planted when I was a student. At some point, I don't remember when, Mike Aarons came to me, and he didn't tell me that there was an assistantship available. He told me he had already accepted that I would take an assistantship. The school was being reorganized, and they wanted somebody from the Psych department to see if there was some behavioral science implications to reorganizing the school. That was the charter. And So anyway, long story short, I ended up accepting that assistantship, and that was a key turning point because I came here assuming I would leave to go do more clinical work. And what I found in that assistantship were two things. Number one, I found that there actually was another application, an organizational application to what we were learning here. I never thought about that. I also found something else. I found that I was attracted to the role of being a translator, that the school couldn't understand the humanistic psychology in part because it didn't understand the frame of reference. There were other reasons too, but let's just stop with that. And so I found that I could serve as a translator. From this world, I could talk about that world in a way that this world could relate to. That was attractive to me. That was attractive for me. So after I finished the assistantship, instead of taking the clinical route, I stayed here as a full-time, it was my first full-time change agent job. And so I worked with the president of the school was Ward Pafford and some of the faculty as this reorganization unfolded. And that then helped me begin to understand a little bit about organizational life. And so I spent another year or so as part of an outside firm that were taking executives through basically personal development courses. But they could matriculate through the school and get school credit. So it was just a way of beginning to understand that there was an alternative to clinical work, which I assumed I was going to do. So that led into moving into unclaimed territory. And what I mean by that is I had the good fortune of having some exposure to Alvin Toffler. And for those of you who are familiar, he wrote this book in the 60s about, it's called Future Shock, and his thesis was, as a species, we have a capacity to create more change than we can metabolize. And we get drowned in our own inability to adapt to change. And I bought it. I thought he was right. And if he was right, there's no methodology for that. There's no structure. Clearly, there are people who know how to change, but it had in organizational settings, but it hadn't been documented. So I thought, well, that would be cool. Let me take 6 months and see if I could document some of the patterns of success and failure. So I started a company in '74 to do that. We're still documenting it now. It's obviously way more complex than I ever thought it would be. And to my surprise, you could actually make a living selling the results. And so large corporations became my clients, and I would basically sell them the research findings from a very simple paradigm. What are the mindsets and behaviors that are in place when leaders successfully change and when they don't? How could you replicate success? How could you avoid failure? It was a pretty simple, crude model. But in those days, nobody knew anything about change. So the moving into this unclaimed territory, I was the tallest small person in the room, right? It was just because nothing else was going on. What I then found is that there was worldwide application. So the research was exported, because these were international organizations, so it was exported throughout the world. So we ended up with worldwide data around the patterns of success and failure. At this point, I ran into a bit of a problem, though, because I was being paid to do the research, and I wasn't releasing it, because the findings weren't supporting my hypothesis. My hypothesis was that we were going to find different patterns of successful change. What were leaders doing to succeed with change? We were going to find different patterns. I didn't know if it was by country or by continent, but I knew it wouldn't be the same as the US. And all the work I had done was here. All the data kept coming back in that whether it was London or Johannesburg, exactly the same patterns were unfolding, which completely blew me. I finally realized that I thought I had been studying organizational change. I actually had been studying humans in transition that were clustered in organizations. And once I understood that, it began to make sense to me. So in the intervening years, we have continued to apply it to large corporations and members of Congress. We've been brought into countries. We helped with perestroika and glasnost and dismantling apartheid. So the applications can be either very large or very small, because it's simply how people go through change. And what I would end this period with telling you is that that has led into, now there's a whole profession around change management. And being able to contribute books and blogs has really been fun with that. That's up until a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, it occurred to me that I only have so much longer to practice this craft, and I had spent a lot of years applying this research to organizations that at the crudest level I was helping people sell sugar water and razor blades. Okay, that's honorable work, but these were changes that weren't going to substantively impact the human experience. So I started a new company that would only work with changes that matter. And so that's what I'm doing right now. This organization, our clients are the international NGOs. So Habitat for Humanity and World Vision and Doctors Without Borders. And it's exactly the same work. It's taking humanistic psychology frameworks, applying them to how people are changing in organizational settings. But the difference is that the impact of a change not succeeding with Habitat for Humanity translates into lives, as opposed to a corporation that'll translate into somebody's profit. The grace that I want to speak to is what happened to me here. I came about as unprepared to receive anything as I can possibly imagine. And yet, Mike Ahrens, Henry Moore, Jim Clee, despite my ineptness, despite the blankness that I brought, they invested in me. And so my metaphor for that is they planted seeds. And what I'm so grateful for is, given what they must have seen, they had no hope of harvest, okay? and so that's why I'm going to refer to it as grace. I now know to call it something else. They held the space for me, okay? And in some respects, seeds might not even be the right metaphor. It may be more stem cells, because they didn't know what I was going to do. They weren't planting a pine tree so that I would become a pine tree. They were planting whatever I needed to take it wherever I could go. Right? And it's been wonderful to see some of my colleagues here. I know many of them, they came ready to learn. They were potting soil, ready to rock and roll. Okay? I was sand, rocks. And they didn't invest any less in me than they did in them. I actually went to Jim Clee's office one day complaining because Jim gave everybody an A, okay? Because that's not what you were here for. I didn't get that. And I went into his office just complaining like hell because I got an A and I had busted my ass, and whoever this was had smoked dope the entire quarter, and he got an A too, and I was outraged. And Jim basically, in his own way, just said, you know, it's really about what you're going to do with it. It's not about any grade I give you. And that's the grace I'm talking about, okay? Now, the seeds that I'm going to share with you, some seeds that I've identified that I pulled out of here. But all I'm trying to do is encourage you to identify what the seeds were for you, because obviously these are very personal seeds. But before we get to the seeds, I want to identify some planting methods that I thought that they used on me. This might be a little cryptic, so let me elaborate. They planted in my head as well as my heart. They planted by teaching me as well as by probing beneath the surface. They planted by critiquing and comforting me. They sometimes poured information in. Sometimes they pulled revelations out. Sometimes they were very confrontive. Sometimes they were very accommodating. There were times I felt very alone when I was here, and times I felt part of fellowship. I felt cared for. I felt cut loose. I was exposed to unlimited imagination and confining constraints. I was encouraged to be playful, and I was reminded about boundaries. I was introduced to the divine as well as the self-indulgent. It's 72, okay. I was introduced for the first time here to metaphysical, but also encouraged to probe the practical. The faculty represented ideal role models and anti-role models. There were times I felt deficient, and times I felt assured. I felt depleted sometimes, I felt rejuvenated. I felt completely snowed under, and other times I felt ahead of the game. But I always felt challenged, always, and inspired. None of those have implications for anything other than challenged and inspired. So to me, that's just a little smidgen of how they went about it. Now the lessons I pulled out, let me elaborate on those. I was introduced to authenticity here. And what I learned was that genuineness has for its own sake, will cancel itself out. I learned about my personal impact here, that there's a difference between what I do and who I am, and how vital it is to integrate those two in order to maximize my impact. A seed that was planted for me is, and this ties directly, David, to, this seed was planted actually by Carl Rogers one afternoon, which was the day that he was here. From Carl Rogers, I learned the importance of deeply preparing and then letting it go, so that I wasn't consumed with that. I could be present. And I got that directly from that one time that Carl was here. Because of the way this place ran, I learned that stories were much more, they conveyed much more than facts, and metaphors could be remembered much longer than answers. I was really intrigued with the language I'm going to use is, how do you operationalize humanistic psychology? I was concerned as a student, and certainly afterwards, that this wonderful, incredible entity that we refer to as humanistic psychology ran the risk of becoming self-referencing and not engaging the world. And so I got intrigued with, how do you take what appears to be intangible and bring concreteness to it? And so what I learned, the seed that was planted in me, is with vulnerability and persistence, I might be able to find some definition and structure in what first appears ethereal. But it's vital to always honor the mystery. That whatever I learned here that I could bring concreteness to, there was still more that I would never bring concreteness to, and how important it was to acknowledge that and own it. I learned that the core of who I am is not necessarily a good match with everybody. I learned that from faculty, I learned it from some of the students. But here's what I also learned, that I'm here to impact who I can. I'm not here to engender as much applause as I can get. That seed was planted here. I learned about my insecurities, that when I camouflage my self-doubt with trappings of confidence, that I don't fool anybody but myself, and that doesn't last long. I learned here that I'm a conduit. I'm not a fountainhead. And that as a conduit for energy, my job is to be as ego plaque free as I can be, so I don't distort the energy. That, I tie that directly back to here, and I use that daily in my work, my consulting work. The path that I'm on, I learned that the journey is much easier for me if I'm more thankful than needy, and if I seek guidance instead of outcomes. And once again, that maybe I would have gotten that seed planted somewhere else, I don't know, but there's a direct line of sight as far as I'm concerned back here. And I learned about privilege and responsibility. I learned that when you're blessed with special talents, that there's that duty is a companion with that. What I mean by that is that if you're blessed with special talents, then it's important to be mindful and attentive about where you apply those. they can be wasted if you're not. If I didn't own my talents, then I wasn't going to be as responsible as I should be about where they would be applied. All right, those were by no means all the seeds, but I think that those were representative seeds to share with you. What I'd like to take the rest of our time with, I'm happy to answer any questions you want about what I shared with you, but to me this is about honoring the program. And honoring, what I mean by that is acknowledging how powerful this program is and being thankful for it. So what I'm curious about is, so what are the seeds that either have been planted or still being planted for you? As they've germinated, where has that taken you? And what are you doing about planting those seeds elsewhere? Those are my, that's the platform for how I'd like to spend the rest of our time. Yes, sir.
Well, I came here and I was kind of like an open book, you know, nothing, didn't know what I was even doing here really, except I liked humanism. I had a humanistic book in undergraduate work, Bernard, the Psychology of Personality, and he was a humanist. And so I know I wanted to come here. I researched and which college, but I ended up with this one for something different to do. Instead of Sonoma State, where I grew up in, I was in California, but this just seemed like way out there, you know, and so I came out here. And yeah, whatever went on here, I don't know. I mean, you know, there were all the different cultures out here, and whatever went on really impacted me long term. But it's hard to put a finger on anything. What am I doing with it now? It's funny that all of a sudden it has had a resurgence in me, and this anniversary hit at a point that I'm thinking, I've got to get back to West Georgia just to look around and see what's going on, and then I get this thing about this 50-year reunion. And another thing that I'm doing is for a year now, I've been working on a program of human growth and potential, Mike Aaron's, you know. And I'm going to be doing a senior class called New Dimensions in Colorado, where I'm from. And it's retired seniors helping each other with ideas and different constructs. And the one I wanted to do was human growth and potential. And I guess that's the main thing that I got out of here. And I don't have my notes from Mike Aaron anymore. I'm kind of frustrated, but I'm just developing it on my own. So that's kind of what we're all about anyway. So that's what I'm doing.
So that's what you walked out with, where it's going, and where you're going to take it. Great. Yes, sir.
The authenticity, I could relate to that, and the conduit, I could definitely relate to that. But the other thing that was special about this program was it was allied with the philosophy department and phenomenology, and learning about phenomenology as an alternative lens to science and to medicine. That just benefited me tremendously as a therapist.
Is there a line of sight for you between phenomenology as a study and and application with your clients, your patients?
Yes, because I believe that the better I could understand this person's experience of being in the world, the more I could be of help to them. And the thing about a conduit, keeping my ego out of the way and letting whatever it was flow through me as a therapist.
Yeah.
But the phenomenological lens as an alternative to science was just invaluable.
The reason I ask is that if I had not been, if certain seeds had not been planted, I fell in love with phenomenology here. But I first fell in love with it as a philosophy to study, not to be confused with my life. And the seed that got planted here is, that's powerful stuff, so there's responsibility to actually do something. And you figured out something to do. That's great. Yes, sir.
One of the things I've been impressed with over the 50 years, since the 40 years since I was here, is how a lot of the ideas that were considered radical at that time have now gone mainstream.
Yeah.
I remember Mike Aaron used to say, "We're the Barbary Coast pirates of the intellectual world." And one thing, I've worked in the mental health field for a number of years, and the agency I work with just recently went through accreditation from an international accreditation agency. And their number one principle, get this, is something called person-centered approach. Didn't Carl Rogers say that in the 1960s? And this is like new state-of-the-art, cutting-edge, person-centered approach. And it's not just words. I mean, what they're talking about is really the kind of stuff that Rogers was talking about and we're talking about, where the client, even clients with severe and persistent mental illness, which I'm working with, they can have choice. They can decide what their goals are. They can decide where they want to live and whether they want to go to your group or they don't want to go to your group. And which seems like very common sense, but I know in the 1970s those were really radical ideas. So it's amazing how that's finally come into the mainstream.
I've seen that as well and given some thought to it. I think there's two variables that are at least contributing. One is, I'd like to think we're a little better at translating, so we can make a little more sense to someone other than ourselves. But I think the context has changed. And what I think has changed in the context that we operate in is I think there's a lot more scar tissue now than there used to be. And my experience is that things don't land really deeply unless there's scar tissue there. And so I think the world has suffered more and allowing us with hopefully better articulation, and I think maybe that's at least part of the convergence. Yes, ma'am.
I want to honor Daryl because I had a chance to spend about a year with him in a postmaster's program. You had a company called OD Resources then, and it was a very fledgling field organizational development, and this man is like the founder of that field. And he developed assessments and he developed instruments that are used all over the world. And that year that I spent with you was just really so useful because I became a corporate psychologist too. And what he did was he took all, Kubler-Ross and all the different people's principles and made them viable in a corporate context, in a corporate setting. So it doesn't surprise me at all that your world went on your work went on to have worldwide impact. And I remember you here too, because you were very kind of military and, like you said, sort of arrogant and very black and white, and everyone else was like kind of do your own thing and lovey-dovey and everything. But we needed you, and the fact that you, I can just feel Mike Aaron's here, like being so proud of you that you were the one who was like the bridge from all those, kind of wild hippies to. That you could get people. He was training in Congress. He was training CEOs of major multinational corporations, and you made that happen, Daryl. So just like give him a round of applause. That needed. I want to say.
Let me go back to the Forrest Gump piece, okay?
I want to say about me.
A lot of incredible things happened, but honestly, I was a witness to it. I truly was. So. It's important to me. It's important for me to acknowledge that, Donna. Thank you very much. But the whole notion of being a conduit, not a source, it's important.
And one of the things I just want to finish to say about me too, when we were here, one of the biggest differentiations in humanistic psychology is that we studied, like Maslow taught us, the farther reaches of human nature, how to be smarter, how to be better, how to be more flexible, how to be more open, how to be more productive. And I spent 40 years in my career in so many contexts, kind of figuring how to be more loving, how to be more intuitive, how to be, there's so many different ways that we learn to be more of who we are. So even today when I meet people and I tell them I'm a psychologist, it's the first thing is, where's the couch? Are you going to find all my problems? So there's still a lot of work to go in terms of how we go from studying and looking at sick people to how we can focus on what is all that we can be. But I really want to honor all the faculty and everyone, and I see Ann and Fred Richards, so many of you here taught us how to look for all of what we can be. And I'm just most grateful for West Georgia for teaching us that. And I'm so glad we got to come back too.
I could answer some of those things, but there's something that's more important to me than what happened here. And I guess I would say, it's hard to even say, this is my experience and then what did I get from it? Because that's like saying, why do you love your daughter? It's like, I don't know how to be me not loving my daughter, right? And so really what got locked in here is a kind of a central organizing principle, which is that everything I do has to come from my own awareness and my own authenticity and my own integrity around that, and that becomes kind of the life force. And it's no longer this is me and this is what I do, but it's sort of fundamental to everything.
Mhm.
And I got that very deeply here.
And you, I attended your session, you operationalize that in your work, right? That's wonderful.
Yeah, I can't even put into words like this, but to be here in 74 and 75, and it was like later on when the Celestine Prophecy was written, it was like that. We showed up, a lot of us floated in, we weren't sure how we got here, why were we here, what we were seeking, but it was a place to experience and experiment. It was a place to be evocative in your own humanness as well as learning. It was monumental. I went on and got a degree in transpersonal psychology after that, thanks to Ann and Fred Richards and Paul Phillips and George Tate and others, so I followed that. And I still didn't know what I was going to do with it. Even my dad said, "What are you going to do with this degree?" I don't know. I thought I'd work at Esalen Institute or something. I wasn't going to be a psychologist, for God's sake. But then I became a psychologist, but I always said more like a wolf and a sheep in wolf's clothing. I didn't play the pathology game. I was always more humanistic. And then I became a coach and helped one of the early people help start what's the coaching profession for today. But even if I hadn't called it that, no matter what I called myself, what was instilled in me here was that whole be yourself, learn yourself. Like Oscar Wilde said, you might as well be yourself because everyone else is already taken. But I didn't know who I was. This helped me start to learn that. I have one curiosity though. You mentioned Carlos Castaneda twice without speaking to it. What was that connection? I'm just curious.
I was looking for C's for each of those pieces. And honestly, Castaneda's work sort of it's a reference point for me during that period here. It not only was something that we were all reading, but it represented what this place was about to me, in the sense that it was beyond any way to describe, and yet it was real. It pushed me in, and I found ways of externally manifesting that. So it just became emblematic. The reference that I was making earlier to, I got this from the Castaneda work, and that is to ethical trickery. For those of you that, if you haven't read the work, go read the work. But you may not remember that one of the tenets was ethical trickery. So when he went to learn from the shaman, what I got out of it was he asked, "Will you teach me about using peyote in a religious rite?" And so that was the ask, and the answer was yes. The ethical part of an ethical trick is you must do what somebody has asked you. If you say yes, you have to do that. The trick is, we're going to go at this like in ways you would never believe. I use that with my clients. My clients ask me, "Will you help me with the merger? Will you help me bring in technology? Well, whatever." I go, "Yeah, of course I will." And what I know is the CEO and I at some point are going to have a very deep conversation about how he or she is showing up. And the authenticity it takes to lead transformational change, because it's very different than incremental change. And how deep the roots have to, I know that we're going to have to get there. Now, I don't know that they're going to, I scare a lot of them off when we get there. I don't know if they're going to finish that discussion. I know we're going to start the discussion when I say yes. So that's how practical all this stuff is for me. I literally use that knowing that my yes, they're accepting my yes in a very shallow way, and I have to take responsibility for that. I even gave it a label. When clients say, "Yes, let's move forward," I call it uninformed optimism. It's optimism based on insufficient data. You know why they're excited that I'm going to work with them? They don't have a clue. The second phase is informed pessimism. And that's when, because on the front end I said, now, I'm going to be giving you some really tough feedback. "Oh, yeah, sure." Well, informed pessimism is when they get the feedback. That's when I can test, are we going to be able to, not the honeymoon period at all. So anyway, all this has become very, very practical for me. Yes, sir.
I like hearing how people found this tiny place and how much they got out of it. Rural, small town Georgia.
Yeah.
But I grew up here.
Yeah.
I went to first grade just on Maple Street. And I got as much as any of you.
Amen, brother.
The journey was no less for you than it was for us, right?
No, but it was only half a mile to my home.
But the journey was just as long.
Well, I went a long way to get back here. But
I asked
started-
Mike once, I said, in my stupidness, I said, why didn't you do this at a larger school? And he said, no other place but this would.
Right.
This was the incubation. This is where everything came together. The size. He just rattled off all the variables that it couldn't have happened anywhere else. This was lightning in a jar. Yes, sir.
I'm not a student of this program. I knew Mike Ahrens. My wife was brought from Denmark by Mike Ahrens to Carrollton, Georgia. He taught her. She taught me. I'm a good conservative Southern Baptist minister. She was able to convince me that the Baptists were not the only ones in heaven. And now I am trying to teach other Southern Baptists the same thing, but in the Mike Ahrens way, with lots of love, with lots of hearing, with lots of communicating. Mike was a deep person. I visited with him in the hospital when he was in the hospital in the latter days. He was a great kisser.
I also, 150 years ago, grew up about 20 miles up the road. And I went to a college here, and I graduated in 1965. But I had this one professor whose name was Dr. Thomas, and I will never forget him. And he was somewhat like Carl. He was very authentic. He could listen, and so forth. And so I was not in this program. However, I went to California. I studied face-to-face with God. I studied face-to-face with Fritz Perls. I studied face-to-face with, who is the guy who wrote Hero of 1,000 Faces and did?
Campbell.
Yes, Joseph Campbell. I studied with him. So then I ran the psychiatric emergency services at San Francisco General Hospital at night for 23 years. To let you know what that might have been like, I know every drag queen in 6 counties. And they helped me raise my son. But the point is, where it really led me, I mean, that was giving service to people. And Carl and Fritz Perls and all those people were very, very influential in how I dealt with people. So much so, it just became a part of me. I got a master's degree in kids and families. It was Carl Rogers. And I told him, I've already read on becoming a person. I want to do some other stuff. But where it really led me was into phenomenally deep, deep spirituality within myself. I'm Tibetan Buddhist since 77, 78. I've lived in Peru with shaman and done ayahuasca. And I'm telling you, those things, if you don't get it with all that stuff, you need your antenna tightened. It's not working really.
What I'm really struck with, and I've been aware of this since walking in the door this morning. I mean, it's wonderful to hear all of us talk, and I enjoy doing this as well, about what it's meant for me. But what I'm really struck with is the secondary and tertiary, and the number of times this stone has skipped is just incredible, guys. Absolutely incredible. And my hope is that each of those skips are generating skips, right? It's and how I interpret that is that for many of us, yes, we absolutely needed it for ourselves, but we also have taken responsibility to be some version of this, not just to help others, but to plant seeds and let it move in whatever direction it needs to. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I will never forget is one, it was a symposium that Mike Harris did, where he just asked a very simple question, which is, how far have you come to be here today?
Yeah.
And that was just so profound to me. And it has really reverberated in my work. I'm actually an astrologer, psychological astrologer, so kind of weaves into people's, background and their makeup.
Yeah.
And that just has reverberations so far.
He was such a master with those little innocent questions,
Right.
that stay with us for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. When I got out of high school, I went from college to college to college. I finally graduated from Valdosta State. I grew up in South Georgia. And I left there going, what the hell did I do this for? It's like, I don't know any more about me or anybody else or the world than I did when I got here. 4th or 5th college I've been at. And then I found West Georgia. What appealed to me is there were parapsychology courses here. That's what I was interested in. That's what brought me here. And I can remember one of my professors at Valdosta State said, why do you want to go there? All the freaks up and down the East Coast are there. I said, yep. But when I got here, it was much huger than that. So it was like, I didn't know what I was getting into. It was like, I'm remembering so many things. I wanted everything. I could not stop being with Mike and Jim. And I remember, Jim Clee would give us like 20, 30 books, about the seeds. He would say, this is not to just read during the course, this is for the next 30 years. And I'm still working on it. So when I got here, it was like, I felt so low-key. It was like I wasn't really living who I was. And what happened for me, it was almost like the beginning of my life in a way. It was like I opened up to many things and began to be on that journey, many journeys. And I remember what you said at one of the reunions, and I told you earlier, it's like they want what we have. But when we tell them what it is, they don't like what it sounds like. So we have to speak their language. And I like what you said, translator. And I went to New England and worked with a Gestalt psychiatrist, brilliant guy, surgeon, not much personality, but he was brilliant. And he and his partner were several times over world's champion Latin American dancers. And they would come and perform in the school. It was like you could see the Gestalt work he would do was the same as the dance. And he would say to us in our training is, you dance someone else's dance, and then together you create something different. And both of those say the same thing to me and stuck with me forever. So there's lots more, but I want to tell you, in 2012, for years I was thinking about creating a Gestalt Therapy Institute. In 2004, I did that, and still going today, and we're growing bigger and bigger. And more, for me, it's about mind, body, and spirit, and how we connect with each other. That if I can be with my own process of who I am, then I can be with you. And that's where the change in my life and transformation in other people's lives happens. in that place that we meet and connect, that transformation.
And you're linking all that back to this program.
Yes, and when I come back here, this is like, I feel like I'm home again. You know, it's like energy again. And I'm starting to take that around the country and soon internationally.
Yes,
Maybe
sir.
maybe a further question would be, what seeds are being planted this week as a result of this year? I'm already come up with about 5 new ideas to pursue, just based on the inspiration of meeting people and talking to what other people are doing and these sessions like this. This is a great seed planting activity right here.
Sure. Anything else, guys?
Yes, I have a question. Okay, based on all of this, where do you see this program going next, and where would you like to see it go?
I don't have a clue where it's going. So I only mean that in the sense that I'm out of the loop. I don't know what the plans are for the program. But the second part of your question, you know, if I have an aspiration for this, it is for the program to obviously to continue to evolve while it holds the center of its gravity, right? The DNA that brought us all here. But that as it pursues, it's the duality, non-duality, as it pursues all of the openness and all of the creativity that we drew from, that it also encourages application.
Yes.
And the bridge between those two, to me, is responsibility.
Right.
This place is a rare place, and I would contend that if you show up here as a student, you're rare. I believe the faculty is rare. Rare resources are not to be wasted, and they're to be responsibly applied. And so my wish would be that the program furthers that notion that when you walk out of here, if you were touched, you have a responsibility. We can't tell you what to do with it. We can tell you that it was special that you were touched, and you have a responsibility to do something about it. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.